We're actually going to do something a little bit different this week. I think sort of exploring different ideas and things we can do over the coming months. One of the ideas that we discussed at the very beginning of the year when we were thinking about planning sessions this year was to try and get more people from outside of Netcall involved in some of the drop-in sessions. I know we've done some of this before, but one of the other ideas was to start to bring in experiences that go beyond the boxes and lines and the process mapping and so on. So it was with those sort of thinking through, trying to bring that in, that Claudia and I had a bit of a conversation. I thought actually Claudia's got some great experiences that'd be great to share with the group here. So these will always be topics that are very closely aligned with looking at processes, or adjacent to the topics that are very specific to Spark itself. And Claudia and I have known each other for 3, maybe 4 years. I was trying to think when we first met, but it's going back a number of years. I think many of you will probably recognise Claudia because she's quite a regular attendee on these sessions. So essentially, the session today is going to be a little bit of a conversation. Now, we titled it the human side of operational excellence, designing effective processes where departments have competing mandates. And again, when Claudia and I were talking about this session and the topics about it, we got into talking or sharing stories about these times where you focus on trying to optimize processes within the organization, but then you bump up against another process or team which you perhaps have been involved in or maybe not, but optimizing that, and then suddenly you seem to have these sort of conflicting objectives within the processes. So that's kind of what we wanted to share, some experiences today. Again, we haven't discussed it. We've both got a story to tell. So we're going to go through those in a second. At the end of the session, by all means, ask any questions, any thoughts on the discussion. And as always, if you've got general questions about Spark, we can pick those up at the end as well. But I suppose just a few kind of pointers before we dive in. I think the key thing that we want to get across is to think about that human element of it. I always find it fascinating. Humans are very complex. And often, you sort of do all the things that the textbook tells you in terms of how to align people, but they don't always behave the way that you would hope or expect them to. So this is, a lot of this is about how do we align the people with the processes and systems, but sometimes you just have to take that additional think more about the human side than the process or system side. So I suppose, Claudia, I mean, over to you. I know we've had this specific experience, but do you want to sort of tell us a little bit more about the story that we discussed the other day?
Yeah, thank you. So I was working in a biotechnology company, and we were a small biotechnology company. So one of the things I loved about Liberty Spark is that it really allowed everyone in the organization to take ownership of their process improvement. And they did so. Oh my goodness, they took off with it. We did some 3 weeks of training to teach them, how to map a process, how to have better conversations within their departments so that they could start filling in gaps. And they really took off. So everything's great, right? Not so much. So I came across a situation where we have the legal department, and our legal department is really, really focused on protecting the IP of the organization. And we have another group in the organization called clinical contracts. So when you're in a biotech company, you're running clinical trials, but you're not running them yourselves. You're partnering with hospitals and other clinical sites. And before a clinical trial gets started, a contract needs to be put in place. So you can think about the clinical contracts group as kind of like a procurement department. And so they're being measured on cycle time, on speed to get these contracts finalized. So they were bumping into a lot of conflict with the legal department because the legal department is in charge of protecting the company's IP. And so when you're doing a clinical trial, you're sharing your IP with this clinical trial site. And so they're very cautious about how that is done. But the procurement, this clinical contracts team, they're being measured on cycle time reduction. So they were not happy, these two groups.
Yeah, that kind of leads to a bit of conflict, doesn't it, between the two? And that was the point when we were discussing this one. I've seen
Yeah,
this before, but in a very different context. What
yeah.
happened in your case then?
So in my case, what I did is I mapped the process that the procurement team had developed, our clinical contracts team had developed, and I mapped the process that the legal team had, kind of as, how do you say, as objective as possibly from their SOPs. And then I brought representatives from the two groups together, and the legal team walked through their process, and they talked about why they designed it that way to protect the organization from any legal risks. And during this time, the clinical contracts team, they just listened. And then it was the clinical contracts team turn to share their process and how they were trying to fulfill the company's mission, get our therapies to more patients sooner. And so the legal team just listened. And so they really started to develop more empathy for each other. And they then, after that conversation where they just kind of listened and asked questions about why had they done it this way, did they think about the impact that it was going to have on them, on each other, they decided to kind of redesign the process together so that they would have a process that would work for both. It would cover legal's concern about the risks of sharing IP, and then it would also cover the company's mission, which is to get therapies to patients sooner, as quickly as we possibly can. To do that, we need to get these clinical sites up and running. So after that, they piloted it for with a few teams. It worked really, really well for both of them. They made some tweaks, of course, and then they rolled it out to the rest of the organization. And so for me, this was a really, really good example of, yes, teams and their departments, they do a wonderful job of optimizing their processes for their goals, their specific department's goals. And that's the right thing to do. But sometimes we forget that we're highly interdependent on other parts of the organization. So, really kind of highlighting those areas where I might see some potential conflict in the future was kind of my big learning from this experience. And really just bringing them together, not solving the problem for them, but bringing them together so that they could design something that worked for both teams.
Yeah, interesting. It's both helping them understand that they each
Mm,
have those different objectives, but then helping them understand the impact that they have on each other. I think the comment you made there, which I was really interesting, was about the empathy that once you got them in the room together and discussing it, it sort of diffused what might have been quite a contentious situation before that.
yeah, because contracts were getting slowed down, and no one in the organization likes that. So then it can quickly devolve into a lot of blaming about who's responsible for the delays in contracts. But actually, in this case, both teams were right. They have the right objective. They just need to figure out to make it work. Hi, I think Yabu has a question. Go ahead.
Hi, that's an interesting scenario. I mean, we're quite early in our journey, but it sounds like we have teams who are building out from the middle, I guess, in terms of an understanding of their own processes. And to date, there's not that much sort of overarching joining up of those things. Sometimes it's a challenge to get people to even recognize that the joining up's needed. So, how did you get to get the teams to actually want to be in the room together? What was the trigger for that to actually even happen?
the trigger for that to happen was they started to develop a process for escalations. And I was like, no, wait a minute. That is not what we want.
Building a workaround.
We're gonna build a process to do escalations. It's like, no. We don't want a process for escalations. That's not the right solution for this root cause. We need to actually come together and talk. So I volunteered to facilitate the conversation, and I'm kind of neutral party.
Okay, so that was the burning fun. Well, that was the signal to you to get the
to intervene.
to agree that something else would be a better way to approach that. I guess.
Yes.
Okay, interesting.
If you do Lean Six Sigma, you understand. Oh, we're not addressing the root cause here. If we're building out an escalation process.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean that's also a really good lead into the story that I was going to tell. I mean, when Claudia and I started talking about this, I said, "Oh my goodness, I've got a story that's sort of quite different but very similar in many ways." And this one was it was the same thing. We had to really identify the root cause before we were able to understand who we needed to get in the room together. In this particular context, this was an organization that grows ornamental plants. So if you go to the supermarket or garden centers, you see these plants that you can buy often at the entrance, as I say, to the supermarkets. And what this organization, they grow the plants and then they put them through a warehouse where they sort of process them. They put them into a nice pot. And they put those little cards in it, the sort of care labels. So it tells you what's the variety of the plant, but it also tells you how to look after it. And these are all branded according to the not the end customer, sorry, the supermarket or the garden centre. And the problem that they asked us to come in and look at the time was actually a cost problem. So it was the marketing department were looking to try and reduce certain costs. And what was happening is that they would order these care labels for the plants, and then late in the season, when they were processing orders, they kept running out of the labels. Now, they had the facilities to print custom labels, but it was very expensive to do that. And what was kind of I guess unusual, in hindsight seems quite obvious, but at the time what was difficult for them is that they would get to this point where there'd be an emergency, we need to print these labels, they'd have to go and do it. It was the budget, so everyone was quite sort of very conscious of it happening, but then there'd be a lot of finger pointing afterwards. Why is this happening? And they were pointing very much at the production staff, and they were it was informally, there were kind of accusations of people taking the care labels home. I mean, like, why anyone would want to take these care labels home is beyond me, but that was the sort of the peak of the problem, and there were the sorts of things that happened. And then of course the relationship became quite bad between those two different groups. When we looked at the process, and again, it was a case of sort of starting to just map the process out. It's basic stuff, but getting the right people in the room. We did a very cursory view of the process, and we decided to actually go right back to the planning stage, because we wanted to go, where is the data coming from that they're using to run the production lines and also order the labels for the plants? This was the project that I subsequently called the Exploding Spreadsheets project, and this is what was happening. Initially, what they would do is they'd start off by doing some modeling in order to plan production for the next 12 months, and at the end of that sort of initial planning exercise, they'd export that to a spreadsheet. That spreadsheet would then get shared with marketing, it would get shared with production, it got shared with suppliers. And then each of those audiences would take that spreadsheet and they'd make changes to it, especially the sort of suppliers and production, because they then look at how that modeling has been done and they go, actually, we could produce more of this, or we can't produce this much because of the capacity that we've got available. So they'd all start making adjustments to these spreadsheets. And what was happening is each time they were doing this, they were multiplying the number of spreadsheets that were available. Now, at the center was the planning team who were trying to keep on top of this. But I think at the high point, we counted there were 40 different versions of the same piece of data that was supposed to describe how what the production plan was going to be in the future. And so what was actually happening is that marketing were ordering the labels on data that was out of date by the time they got it. And so they were either massively over ordering some labels or massively under ordering others. But it was that, going back to Claudia's point about the empathy, I remember from that sort of point where people were kind of accusing each other of stealing something that nobody would ever want, to they all sat in the room and just was like, oh, I see what's happening now. And the change in such a short period of time was amazing. Now, when we first looked at it, we thought about just getting all the teams individually to map the processes, but because of the tension, we felt actually it's worth the risk to get some of these people in the room together to do it. So when we went through the planning process, marketing didn't really need to be in there, but we argued that they were a customer of the output of that process, and therefore it was useful to have them in and various other audiences. But by doing that, it really helped everybody to come together. Now, so eventually what they did was to implement a system where they had a proper planning system, inventory management system, where everyone could see, have visibility and input into that in real time. But that was a very similar sort of challenge.
Yeah. I love this story too, Craig, because I think it points to the same thing. Rapidly relationships start to devolve when we don't actually have a people problem, we have a process problem. Both of these situations it was just process related. It wasn't really people related. There weren't any bad actors in terms of wanting, in my case, wanting to delay contracts, or in your case, nobody was wanting to steal the labels.
No, it's interesting. I mean, my experience has always been that people, with a very rare exception, people always want to do the right thing. And they think they're trying to do the right thing with the information that they've got available to them. And it's where that's not clear or hidden in some way that some of these challenges arise. I think the other thing is that getting these people in the room, they become so much more effective afterwards. I mean, after that exercise, we went through a number of other processes with these teams in this organization, and I remember one of them saying, after one of the workshops, they said, this has been such a great piece of work, because it's brought, as a company, it's brought us back together again. Like we are collaborating more because we're getting to know each other again, whereas we'd started to drift apart in our silos. So just using process had really helped them reconnect. And I just love that you get people leave the room and they're sort of talking about things where they haven't talked about for a long time, and they become build trust and they collaborate better.
But that's also an outcome of having good processes, right? That they do support better collaboration between groups.
Yeah, indeed. I suppose, Claudia, have you got any kind of takeaways that you share with anyone? I think there's been quite a lot in there you've shared already, but
I still think Liberty Spark is great for getting your organization started. Let them start experiencing process improvement right away, because it builds momentum for the organization. But I would say my watch outs now are in organizations that require a high degree of collaboration. Ensure that they're talking to one another, that they understand that they are interdependent on one another. And just some of the signs that I look out for that potentially there's a process broken is any type of blaming or finger pointing. Right now I immediately put a stop to that. I was like, no, let's go and look at our processes and systems first before we go down that path. You need to put a stop to that immediately. And then yes, anytime you see like lots of escalations, that decisions are being escalated to very senior leaders in the organization, that's also a sign to me that a process might be broken, because you want decisions for for speed and effectiveness in your organization. You want the majority of your decisions to get pushed down where they belong. And so when I see a lot of escalation pathways, then I start to say, let's take a look at our processes again. They're not supporting good decision making at the right levels. Mm-hmm. And it's not to say that some escalations are needed. In some situations they are, but when you're seeing a lot of them, I would go and take a look at the processes with the teams.
Brilliant. I think the one thing I would add, and for those of you who know me, have probably heard me talk about this quite a lot before, that tension between often sort of competing priorities between different departments, it's not always obvious. Like sometimes it can sort of you can think everyone's working towards the same purpose, but it's not always clear. One of the tools that I've talked about an awful lot in these sessions and on our training sessions and coaching sessions is really simple exercises when you're documenting a process, is try to think of the purpose. So if you're defining a process, a simple 1 or 2 sentence purpose statement can often help clarify to those involved what we're trying to achieve. I've got a lot of stories in the past where we've started this type of exercise, and the people in the room have got a different view of the purpose of the process. Often that's because they're talking about different processes, but that in itself is just really, really valuable to have that conversation and can really help to clarify for people. So on that. Sorry,
yeah, I'd be interested if anyone has like a similar story to share, like a similar experience, or if they're starting to see some of these things now that they're implementing Liberty Spark and really giving ownership of process improvement to their teams and their organization.
The Yabo thinking.
Yeah.
Well, probably not. We're probably not far enough along yet. I think we're more at the sort of we're still being challenged in terms of using it well, within teams. And there's all sorts of Frankenstein versions of work, of using visual mapping tool for something that's completely unrelated to UPN, and some people have decided to use it for all sorts of different purposes, which is fine, but it. Reminding people what UPN is probably where I'm still at.
Yeah.
And trying to embrace that in a more and it's definitely helped in some of the ways you've described. I mean, we've had some areas of the organization where we're sort of firefighting consistently, and it's been kind of we've had those teams working together and putting process together using Spark, and it's been super helpful. I think it's actually extending that kind of creative spark and energy outside of kind of firefighting areas, which is where I'm sort of at the moment.
I was going to say, one of the things that don't be frightened of is I've seen situations where you've had that sort of firefighting, and it's always valuable to sort of just stop and go, let's look at the process. Even if the process is quite simple, it might be as simple as 3 or 4 boxes on a page. But the point is, it gives you a visual framework to hang the discussions off. And, often if you, without something visual like that, you can end up discussing the problem and going round in circles, and you'll find yourself after 45 minutes of discussion, you're sitting there going, I'm sure we've talked this through already. Why have we come back to it? Whereas if you've got the visualization, and as I said, it could be 3 or 4 boxes, but you essentially can talk through it step by step. And then, okay, we're not talking about that bit anymore. We're talking about that. And often it kind of speeds up the conversation. So, you might think, well, we're not doing that much in terms of mapping a process because we've only ended up with a handful of boxes on the page, but it's more about the value of getting people aligned, talking through the challenges they face, and discussing fixes for the problems.
I think it's worked really well where because there's a sense of kind of urge or a need to solve the problem, that people come together and they work through their kind of challenges and want to put that energy in. It's more challenging where there isn't a perception that there is a challenge or an issue, or to get to the commitment to actually do the work, should we say. That's, I think, where I'm at.
Mhm.
Yeah. Excellent. So, well, I'm going to say thank you very much, Claudia, for sharing your story.